Democrats are becoming increasingly uneasy about the growing student protest movement in campuses around the country. It's not just the issue whether the protests are pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, or both. It's the history of student movements shaking up the entire political system, sometimes with unintended results. That's not to say Democrats, or Republicans for that matter, aren't worried of protesters falling into the trap of an anti-Semitic, either-or, pro-Palestine, anti-Israel mentality. Security of students on campus, whether they take sides or not, and whichever side they take, is also keeping many outside observers on edge. And many top Democrats have expressed anger and disgust at the Netanyahu government for its conduct of the war in Gaza. In March, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called for elections in Israel. That is a huge step in the political world. It's just not something that happens. But that's where politics and activism clash. A momentous move in one field is milquetoast, or worse, in the other. In the 1960s, the Vietnam War enraged student protesters, who were by and large more likely to vote for Democrats than for Republicans. Democratic President Lyndon Johnson, who escalated the war, called it quits ahead of the 1968 election and set off a series of events that would pit Democrats against the anti-war movement, including the student protesters. And 1968 was a terrible year in politics and civil rights. Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated, and protests outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago turned violent. The police response was so bad that it's known as the police riot. The protesters were not a homogenous group. They went from radical groups who actively supported the Viet Cong to college students who simply didn't see the point of the war. But as one Chicago cop put it, a long hair was a long hair. Vice President Hubert Humphrey, a liberal, became the Democratic nominee amid the chaos. He started his vice presidency opposing the war, but had his arm twisted by Johnson to support the war between 1966 and 1968. So in September of '68, Humphrey had enough, and he broke with Johnson in a speech opposing the war. It was a big deal in politics, meh for the activists. And the damage from the convention mess put a dent in Democratic aspirations. Former Vice President Richard Nixon beat Humphrey in November, despite his liberal record. And Nixon had no such record. In some ways, he set the frame for modern conservatism. And under Nixon, the student protest movement suffered. It all hit a peak in 1970 when the Ohio National Guard killed 4 protesters at Kent State University. Nixon eventually ended the war, but not before conducting a massive bombing campaign and illegally invading Cambodia. And the student protest movement, it dissipated, and many of the baby boomer students of the 1960s, they ditched flower power for power suits. And that's not the whole story. Some say universities, activists, and police have improved their management of protests to avoid violence, as our own Lexi Lonis reported. But the politics, as The Hill's Alex Bolton reported, have eerie echoes of 1968 for Democrats, even some who attended the infamous convention in Chicago, like Senator Peter Welch of Vermont. This year has 2 more things in common with 1968. The Democratic Convention will be held in Chicago, and the Rolling Stones are still touring.